Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Alyssa Gresh, and I'm here tonight on behalf of the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists. I'm also an officer of the Jewish Lawyers Guild, and I say that because much of my life does, in fact, center around my identity as a Jew and as the grandchild of Holocaust survivors. Though when you do think about it, we are really all survivors of the Holocaust. In 1939, the Jewish population had peaked at around 16.6 million people. As of 2021, the world's Jewish population was estimated at around 15.2 million. So after more than 82 years, the Jewish population still isn't even close to reaching pre-war levels. On January 27th, 1945, the Soviet army entered Auschwitz and liberated more than 7,000 remaining prisoners. Most of them were ill and dying. It's estimated that at minimum 1.3 million people were deported to Auschwitz between 1940 and 1945. Of these, at least 1.1 million were murdered. By the end of World War II, the Holocaust had claimed the lives of over 6 million Jewish people, nearly 2 out of every 3 in Europe. 1.5 million slain Jewish children never experienced adulthood. Numbers tell part of the story, but the horrors of the Holocaust can never be reduced to numbers. Prisoners in Auschwitz were tattooed with a number indicating how many prisoners had preceded them, thus being reduced to their number. And then those who survived lived with a constant reminder of what the numbers on their arms actually meant. 7,000 prisoners were liberated, but what did liberation look like for them? Most of them were sick or dying. Many of those who lived would suffer from illness for the rest of their lives. Most of their families had been killed. What would the world that they would be liberated into look like for them? The world could no longer ignore the Holocaust. People would have to figure out how to move forward in the wake of the horrors that many of them had allowed to take place. Some people knew they had a duty to help rebuild, to begin to restore a society that had been broken. Many asked, what could justice possibly look like in the face of these unimaginable murders, tortures, thefts, crimes against humanity? But there were those who would devote their lives to finding ways to bring some measure of justice to a world that had lost its way. Donald Burris, Eli Rosenbaum, and Arthur Traldi, our speakers tonight, are but 3 of the individuals who have given their lives to the law, to the pursuit of a justice that often evades us, yet we still continue that pursuit. Mr. Rosenbaum and Mr. Burris have devoted their lives to, respectively, finding and prosecuting Nazi war criminals and recovering Nazi-looted art. Mr. Traldi served as a prosecutor at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, litigating cases involving charge of genocide. Now he works at the Brandeis Center, combating anti-Semitism and ensuring that never again is a promise that remains fulfilled. But before I turn this over to them, I'm just going to say one last thing. Genocide, persecution, they begin with hate. We have witnessed and continue to witness countless atrocities and genocides in the Soviet Union, Cambodia, Armenia, Rwanda, Greece, Bangladesh, Darfur, Croatia, former Yugoslavia, Myanmar, Haiti, Iraq, Syria, China. It's countless. And today, here in the United States, we still see that hate far too often. And so I remind you today, though I know that many of you who are here don't need this reminder, Whenever you see hatred targeted at a group of people based solely on their identity, make sure that you look for ways to stop that hatred before it grows into a movement, before it takes on a life of its own, before it's too late. So the first person we're going to hear from tonight is Arthur Traldi. And Arthur, I'd like to turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Alyssa. That's a hard introduction to follow. That was very powerful. It's an honor to be here with AHALJ and always just incredibly humbling to speak at a Holocaust Remembrance event. First, I apologize if I don't sound quite like myself. I'm fighting a little bit of a cold, so if I turn my camera off when I'm not speaking, it'll be to avoid being a distraction from my more distinguished colleagues on this panel. It's a great honor, too, to appear with Don and Eli. I should note that I'm speaking for myself today, not any of the organizations Alyssa mentioned or didn't mention that I've had the honor to work with her for. On my own bat, I'm going to try to cover a bit of ground here in a short time. I'm going to focus on the first steps towards justice for the Holocaust, the major war criminals trial before the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg and the subsequent proceedings in the Nuremberg courtroom and the legacy of those proceedings. Nuremberg is unique in the history of international criminal justice. It's unique in several ways. First, it's unique because it came first. Justice Robert Jackson, the lead American prosecutor, began his opening statement by saying, "The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility." That isn't to say there'd never been a war crimes trial before. Peter von Hagenbach was tried in the 15th century, for example, but Nuremberg was the first properly international court. Second, it is unique in what the Allies had to choose in order to establish it. The Allies chose a legal process to hold individuals in the Nazi leadership responsible for crimes they themselves had committed, where they had lawyers, could cross-examine witnesses, challenge documents, could testify on their own behalf and introduce other evidence in their own defense, and where some people who had been charged were acquitted. Justice Jackson and the other Nuremberg architects determined it was necessary to make sure the process was fair and applied standards that would withstand the test of time. That perhaps is the greatest legacy of Nuremberg, both for the facts of the Holocaust and for subsequent international criminal proceedings. Third, it is unique in the level of evidence the prosecutors had. The judges in the Einsatzgruppen case, one of the subsequent cases in the Nuremberg courtroom, required that high level of evidence. They wrote, "The charge of purposeful homicide in this case, which related to the Holocaust by bullets in 1941 in Latvia and Lithuania, Ukraine, reaches such fantastic proportions and surpasses such credible limits that believability must be bolstered with assurance 100 times repeated." The prosecution was able to meet that high burden because the judges could also write, "The case of the prosecution is founded entirely on these official accounts prepared by the Einsatzgruppen and Einsatzkommando leaders." They wrote down what they did. In many ways, there was a greater quantity of evidence in some ways in some recent cases. ICTY had more forensic pathological evidence than any other international tribunal I'm aware of, for instance. But the Nazis were unique among defendants in having clearly reported their crimes up the chain of command. The Einsatzgruppen judgment goes through a litany of reports. 10,000 people killed here, 126 here, 1,013 there, all written down and proudly submitted to their superiors to confirm that they were carrying out the criminal plan that was the Holocaust. And the notorious Group A report repeatedly makes clear that total extermination of Jews, of gypsies, of the insane, and what the Nazis called, quote, Asiatic inferiors, unquote, was official policy. The Auschwitz commander, very appropriate to mention this week, gave a statement admitting to more than 1 million murders. Otto Ohlendorf, one of the Einsatzgruppen commanders, admitted to 90,000 by his particular group. The figure of 6 million killed Jews that is the historical consensus today was given in Justice Jackson's opening statement and is held up for 75 years. As those details suggest, the fourth way Nuremberg is unique is the enormity of the crimes. Here's another thing Jackson said in his opening. Let there be no misunderstanding about the charge of persecuting Jews. What we charge against these defendants is not those arrogances and pretensions which frequently accompany the intermingling of different peoples, and which are likely, despite the honest efforts of government, to produce regrettable crimes and convulsions. It is my purpose to show a plan and design to which all Nazis were fanatically committed to annihilate all Jewish people. The conspiracy or common plan to exterminate the Jew was so methodically and thoroughly pursued that despite the German defeat and Nazi prostration, this Nazi aim largely has succeeded. Only remnants of the European Jewish population remain in Germany, in the countries which Germany occupied, and in those which were her satellites or collaborators. Of the 9.6 million Jews who lived in Nazi-dominated Europe, 60% are authoritatively estimated to have perished. 5,700,000 Jews are missing from the countries in which they formerly lived, and over 4.5 million cannot be accounted for by the normal death rate, nor by immigration, nor are they included among displaced persons. History does not record a crime ever perpetrated against so many victims, or one ever carried out with such calculated cruelty. That has held up and well historically, and remains the case in my view today. With that general outline of Nuremberg in mind, today is in part about restitution, and I want to note that it's in no recent discovery that, as the State Department put it in 2020, the Holocaust also included, quote, one of the largest organized thefts in human history. Here is part of what the judges in the major war criminals trial, the main Nuremberg case, wrote about defendant Alfred Rosenberg. Rosenberg's responsible for a system of organized plunder of both public and private property throughout the invaded countries of Europe. Acting under Hitler's orders of January 1940 to set up the Hochschule, he organized and directed the Einsatzstab Rosenberg, which plundered museums and libraries, confiscated art treasures and collections, and pillaged private houses. Like the Einsatzgruppen's murders, these crimes were meticulously recorded, and the judges noted that Rosenberg's own reports showed tens of thousands of Jewish homes plundered in the West, 38,000 in Paris alone, and tens of thousands of railroad cars transporting confiscated material to Germany, tens of thousands of art treasures that had been seized by the Einsatzstab in the West. I don't want to suggest Rosenberg's liability was limited to art theft. As the judges noted, he was also personally involved in mass murder on at least one occasion, but it's notable that he was convicted in part because of these thefts. The plunder of culture wasn't limited to Jewish targets. Indeed, previous headquarters of other persecutors of Jews were robbed too. The major war criminals judgment noted several former Tsarist palaces in and near what was then Stalingrad were robbed. There are a couple of legacies of this part of Nuremberg. First, shortly after the Holocaust, the nations of the world entered into the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property. More than 130 countries have joined. Second, crimes against culture have continued to be prosecuted in subsequent international tribunals, including some of the ones that I've worked at. Cultural property's protection today has two primary components. First, it's protected against direct attack during armed conflict. The Nuremberg judges noted in a few instances the demolition of synagogues, for instance, in Nuremberg itself on August 10th, 1938. The second part of that protection, more directly related to restitution, is about the prohibition on plunder of property during wartime, more akin to the thefts that served as part of the basis for Rosenberg's conviction. As a former colleague of mine, Cody Corliss, noted in a recent article, this conviction was the first international enforcement of the protection of cultural property during wartime. Both ICTY, where I worked, and the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia included crimes against cultural property in their statutes, as does the International Criminal Court. In practice, cases there have focused more on protection against direct attack. At ICTY, that included direct attacks on mosques, churches, and the old part of Dubrovnik, for instance, and historically important areas there. I examined expert witnesses who testified about these crimes and heard from witnesses who lived in the areas where sites were destroyed about how their destruction fit into the ethnic cleansing campaigns. And one of the International Criminal Court's few cases has been solely about crimes against culture. Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi, a leader in a group in Mali affiliated with al-Qaeda, pled guilty to directing attacks against historic mausoleums in Timbuktu. Echoing what I'd heard from Yugoslav witnesses, the former prosecutor of the ICC noted in her statement on the case that attacks on cultural property are used to eliminate entire communities and wipe out any traces left of them, their history and their identity, as though they never existed. I think I'll leave it at that eloquent statement of hers, and with that, pass it to Don and Eli to talk about their work vindicating the history, the identity, and the basic rights of Holocaust victims. Alyssa, you're muted.
You're muted, Alyssa. We can't hear you.
I got it.
That's better.
Thank you. Thank you, Arthur. I feel like I just got a primer in international law. Like I'm back in law school again. So next we're going to hear from Eli Rosenbaum, who also I don't think needs much of an introduction. Thank you so much, Eli, for taking a time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
Thank you very much, Alyssa, for the kind invitation. It's a great honor to be with you and with Arthur and Don. Both of you are very difficult acts to follow. Alyssa, you really set the stage for this discussion with your eloquent exposition on the Holocaust and other atrocity crimes of the 20th century. And as you point out, the thread that runs through virtually all of these cases is hatred. And alas, we do not need to look beyond our own borders for examples of hate-fueled violence. And we live in very, very dangerous times now, probably the most dangerous times that Jews have ever experienced in this great land. Arthur, tremendous capsule education on the history of human rights enforcement, especially at Nuremberg, and I thank you for that. I'll try to be brief because I'm really interested in the Q&A part, but I will say that I've worked now for 37 years at the US Department of Justice on the Nazi cases, and it has been certainly the greatest privilege of my professional life to be able to pursue justice on behalf of the victims of the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes, and also post-World War II atrocity crimes. It has been an honor and a privilege to be entrusted by survivors with presenting their testimony in court. And it's been quite a burden sometimes to defend them against the predations of irresponsible defense lawyers, but I think we did well in that. The survivors have been the heroes in all of our prosecutions, men and women, some of whom saw these crimes committed through the eyes of children when they were just very young. They are the heroes of all of these prosecutions. They are willing they have the courage to reopen these psychic wounds that they suffered that can never fully heal. And they do that in order to help American judges who, thank heavens, have never lived through anything remotely approaching the Holocaust or the other atrocity crimes that we prosecute. And the survivors help them understand, as much as any of us can understand, the reality of these crimes as they were experienced by those who were targeted. My gratitude to the survivors is boundless. The work that we've done in the Nazi cases has been almost exclusively civil litigation, denaturalization, and deportation. We're We're still the only part of the Justice Department that is responsible for deportation. Everything else after 9/11 went over to ICE when Homeland Security was created. That notwithstanding, the burden of proof on us is denaturalization is substantially identical, the Supreme Court has said, to the beyond a reasonable doubt standard that applies in criminal cases. And we have worked on the Nazi cases since 1979, when the former Office of Special Investigations was created. Our secret weapon then and now in all of our work, not so secret, has been the historians that we hired to work on our staff and pour through documents and archives all over the world, looking for the needle in a haystack evidence. And our historians have always had the languages that we need in World War II cases, that those were principally German, Polish, Yiddish, which we had, Yiddish, Russian, and trying figure something out. But in any event, they have done an amazing job on that. And I could give a quick example, and that is our successful prosecution of Friedrich Karl Berger, who was a Nazi concentration camp guard. And we won our case 2 years ago. And he was deported last year back to his native Germany. So for those who thought it's not possible at such a late date to secure a measure of justice, I would point to the Berger case. And the Berger case was initially built around one extraordinary piece of evidence that I still find it hard to believe we had, but we had it. The only document in the world that actually placed Friedrich Berger at a concentration camp. It was a subcamp of the Neuengamme concentration camp in wartime Germany. And that was an index card of, in a series of index cards of guards that was on a ship onto which the Nazis placed Neuengamme inmates at the harbor of Lübeck, Germany, a week before the war ended, and set sail with them. To what end, it's not entirely clear. But the Royal Air Force, the British Royal Air Force, not realizing who was on that ship, bombed it. And it was one of the worst catastrophes in maritime history in terms of loss of life, many thousands of people. 5 years after that, German police raised the wreck of the ship. It was the SS Thielbeck, and found these waterlogged cards that were still partially legible. They typed the information that they could read, and decades later, the results were in our hands. And thanks to a successful series of interviews, questionings of Berger down in Tennessee, where he lived, and the prosecution of the case in the U.S. Immigration Court in Memphis, which a couple of colleagues of mine and I prosecuted at a time when I thought it was pretty long in the tooth still to be prosecuting Nazi cases, but there it is. We were able to prove all of our allegations, and as I say, pursuant to a removal order issued by the judge, he was deported. The usual result, alas, the receiving countries of Europe haven't prosecuted our former defendants, and that remains so for Berger, who last time I looked was still alive in Germany. There have been countless frustrations in this work, and that's one of them. We prove our cases, we get the people deported, and then nothing is done to them. And you all may be familiar with the newfound German prosecutorial enthusiasm for bringing Nazi cases in the wake of the Demjanjuk case, after we delivered Mr. Demjanjuk to Germany. And their contention there is this was not possible before the court decision in Demjanjuk. I'm here to say that's a bunch of baloney. Could have been done all along, and lots of people that we deported to Germany, Nazi criminals, like the very first case that we had that I worked on. We deported the first Nazi from the United States to Europe back in 1983. I think it was, Hans Lipsius, an Auschwitz guard, actually a guard at Birkenau death center at Auschwitz. And the Germans immediately said, no, there's nothing we can do about that. 30 years later, after Demjanjuk, they suddenly said, oh, we can do something, but it was too late because his medical status had taken a nosedive. So we have frustrations with foreign governments, those that won't take people back, and that has usually been Germany's position, those that don't prosecute, those that won't assist us. For many years, that was Austria, and in our Pacific cases, Japan. The antics of defense lawyers sometimes coming very close to calling the Holocaust, the reality of the Holocaust into question, the extraordinary opposition of various groups, most of them based in the Baltic American and Ukrainian American communities, to disable our little office. We were never really more than 50 people, and to close us down. And in that effort, they had allies, high-profile allies, most notably Patrick Buchanan, who, by the way, was permitted to attack us publicly even while he was working in the White House. And that's not how change is effected within the government. You don't go public. If he had a problem with us, he could have called the Attorney General and raised his concerns. Probably he did, but anyway. Their efforts were so bad and so tenacious that and a lot of anti-Semitic text was found in what they were saying, and really very unpleasant stuff. I remember when I called my boss, Neil Schur, during the few years that I was outside the Justice Department. Neil, of blessed memory, you may know that he suddenly died in October. And he is the former, I forgot what the title is, the president of the predecessor of the AHLJ, a really extraordinary pursuer of justice and a dear friend. And Neil complained that he was spending 2/3 of his time defending the program. When I then came back as his deputy, I joined him in that, and our goal was to fend off all these multiple attackers so that our brilliant staff could do that which they were so good at doing, identifying Nazis, investigating them, and bringing them to justice in American courts. One of the tools we lacked in our legal arsenal is one that Arthur mentioned. There was no crimes against humanity statute on the books in the United States in Title 18 of the US Code. And sad to say, in 2022, there still is no crimes against humanity federal criminal statute. Of course, crimes against humanity got their courtroom debut at Nuremberg. Justice Jackson strongly advocated including that in the charter of the tribunal. And not everybody knows that the crimes against Jews, Holocaust crimes, were generally prosecuted at Nuremberg as crimes against humanity. They did not have genocide in their charter. It was a newly defined offense and was not yet really part of international law. So they were proved as crimes against humanity. Both efforts to enact crimes against humanity bills in the Congress in 2009 and 2010 failed. They didn't even get out of committee. Just some of us older folks will see the similarity with the effort to get the genocide convention ratified by the Senate. So we were among the first to sign it right after the war, and then it took until President Reagan was president, decades later, to finally get it ratified. And then Congress gave us a milquetoast enforcement statute, which was only fixed in 2009. So, I mean, I'm certainly not going to be here 40 years from now to see if the crimes against humanity law passes, but hope springs eternal. In addition to our regular cases, we have taken on any number of special projects. For instance, we documented allegations and made them public, the proof public, that Klaus Barbie, the infamous Gestapo chief of Lyon, France, had been assisted by U.S. Army counterintelligence after the war in fleeing French justice and making his way to Bolivia. We then undertook a much more comprehensive investigation of U.S. Army CIC utilization of Nazis, got that report declassified as we had with the Barbie report, got it made public. We investigated, and I was not part of that, I had to recuse myself, the Nazi past of Kurt Waldheim, former Secretary General of the United Nations, with the result that the proof that OSI amassed persuaded the State Department that he should be put on the watch list of aliens ineligible to enter the United States, the first time any head of state, because he was by then elected president of Austria, any head of state had been formally barred from entering the United States. We also worked on looted art, which we'll get to, and other matters. I am also the cheerleader for our program. I forgot to bring my little uniform and pom-poms, but I will immodestly say on behalf of my colleagues that a couple of years ago in 2020, the Washington Post noted that we were the most successful program of our kind in the world, and that in the 20-year period from 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed and prosecutors could finally get in to see the mother lode of captured Nazi documents behind the Iron Curtain, we won more cases than did all the other governments of the world put together, including Germany. And that is at once, I think, a tribute to the work that my colleagues did and their devotion to this project. But it's also a sad commentary on Germany and Austria, where, after all, the vast majority of perpetrators remain. They never left. They didn't go to South America. You know, that's mostly novelist and Hollywood stuff. And they didn't go to North America either. They stayed where they were. And shame on Germany for not having done a better job. I would close by saying that part of the legacy of what we've done, I think, is the enormous number of court decisions that we've won, many of which are reported in, FSUP, FSEC, Supreme Court reports, the transcripts of our trials, all of which we took the initiative to donate to the Holocaust Museum a few years ago. And it was Judge McCasey who presided over that transfer as the Attorney General, and it was a wonderful program. And again, having promised to be short and have violated that promise, I thank you all for your patience. And again, Alyssa, for the wonderful invitation. Great to be with you.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you. It was a lot to take in, certainly, but you've done such incredible work. Thank you. And so last but certainly not least, we are going to hear from Don Burris, and I'm going to, if you hold on one moment, I'm going to share some slides since Don will be speaking about art restitution, so it will definitely be helpful for everyone to see the art which he speaks. Okay. Okay. Thanks. Don.
Oh, I thought you were going to introduce the painting. I apologize. I didn't want to interject. Thank you. No problem. Thank you very much, Alyssa. Thank you very much, the other persons in the organization. Thank you, Arthur, and thank you especially, Eli. Eli Rosenbaum has been a real hero of those of us who are in the fraternity and sorority of what we call looted art attorneys for many years. And we're proud of what he's done. And by a complete coincidence, he and I grew up in the same town on Long Island. He's much younger than me, but really, we've benefited so much from what he's done. It's very hard to encapsulate 30 plus years of civil litigation dealing with looted art in a few minutes, but I will try to give you a perspective on it, and I think maybe sort of some understanding. As by way of background, I grew up in a place called Brooklyn that maybe some of you have heard of. And I remember as a youth having to visit various doctors, dentists, and whomever who had numbers on their arms. I remember I was 7 years old, 8 years old, and my mother would explain to me what that was about. I didn't quite understand it, but I unfortunately understood it later on. And I kind of feel like I'm doing a small part of the picture. Eli's doing a bigger part of the picture, Arthur working for his organization, but my small part of the picture is kind of kicking Hitler and particularly Goring in the teeth from time to time. I do have one apology. I characterize us, the civilian lawyer community, as Nazi hunters. And the problem when I do that is that people say, oh, we're going to hear later on from George Clooney, or we're going to hear from Ryan Reynolds, or we're going to hear from any of the other actors who've portrayed real Nazi hunters as far as that goes. I have been told that if you use your imagination and understand that my hair is a bit grayer, I could pass for George on the street. But that's, I've been told that by my relatives, basically. The first painting that's up here, Rue Saint-Honoré in the afternoon, is the painting that is before the United States Supreme Court in connection with the so-called Cassira case. Cert was granted and argument was held on this case. It's a beautiful painting. It's one of my favorites in general, even not considering the fact that I'm involved as an amicus in the case. And it sort of sets the backdrop for it. The interesting thing going sort of forward and then coming backward later on is that this is the latest action of the Supreme Court, and it comes on the heels of the 9-0 court rejecting the claims of survivors in both a German case and a Hungarian case that we'll talk about a little bit, but it's hard to really do that as well as go over the history. So we have this before the court. I put this slide here because people ask me, you know, what does it take to bring a case, to understand the case, to work with the survivor and to eventually go over with that survivor the horrible backgrounds, but the current time. Can they slow down slightly, Alyssa? Okay, can you go back to Maria for a second? Sorry, it happens once in a while. Anyway, so I like to put Maria on the screen at the beginning and just focus on her. I thought Helen Mirren did a very good job in Woman in Gold of capturing the essence of her personality and the like. As an aside, Helen Mirren, after the movie, became very, very active in the cause of repatriation of culture and artwork to the Jewish people. And she even testified before Congress in connection with the HERE Act that we'll mention briefly later on. So even though Maria's not with us anymore, her legacy still moves on. There've been a lot of things in my life that have made me happy and proud. But I have to tell you that right at the top was the day that Randy and I told her that she had won in the Supreme Court. It was just unbelievable facing her after all these years and just knowing how she felt and her tender way of expressing her thanks as far as that goes. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the substance of my presentation. You go to the next one. Okay, there's the two guys at the Supreme Court. In case you didn't know it, Randy's on the right and I'm on the left. Now, something other, you have to digest something else. If you remember in the movie, Ryan Reynolds played Randy, and they didn't bother to show you that I was behind Randy or next to him as far as things go. Jumped again. Anyway, what I wanted to say was, it's a little dark in this picture, but if you envision Ryan Reynolds, he's a bit taller than Randy and has a little more hair. And the guy on the right might actually be a Ryan Reynolds, at least in part. So I mentioned that in passing. This was the day of the Supreme Court argument, which was unbelievably, it was a thrill. I had gone to school at Georgetown and I knew Washington, and I really was thrilled to be up there with Randy and presenting our case and the like. Okay, next. if you saw the film The Monuments Men, the gentleman who's next to me on the right there is Harry Ettinger. Harry Ettinger was the German-born monument man who came into the US Army after his family had moved to America. Interestingly enough, the bar mitzvah of Mr. Ettinger was the last legal bar mitzvah for Jews right about Crystal Night overseas. He came over here, became a translator, and he got back to just a person that you could sit with for hours and stuff like that. Another person you sit for hours with is my wife, who's right next to me. Okay, here we go. Sorry, next. This is a photograph that's been seen very often of the monument men going into the salt mines and finding, in this case, a Manet painting. The Germans had to find places to store away the paintings. And so they often used salt mines, castles, other creative places where they would keep the paintings in good shape as far as storage was concerned. And they would, hopefully they would then be repatriated. Now what happened, just briefly, is the monuments men would find a work of art. They would then bring it to a central depository. There were a couple of them, one in Munich and some others, and they would be sorted out, the paintings. The problem was that I know in the Monuments Men movie that they have a scene of, I think it's Matt Damon going back to a Jewish apartment, putting a painting on the wall. That didn't happen. The Monuments Men charge, which was very effective for what they did, was to return the paintings to the countries of origin. So in some cases, for example, widows of high Nazis ended up getting some of the paintings back because it went to the country, and of course the original owners were dead and there were no claims by a museum or anything like that. That actually was the genesis of much of the civil work that we've been doing, because we take it one step further. We try to find the painting, we try to find the owner. We're often hired by the owner himself or herself, and we go out to try to retrieve the painting or get some justice and some compensation, to be fair. Maria was asked, why didn't she just keep Woman in Gold on the wall of her home in West Los Angeles? And the answer to that is, would you, having just been awarded a $135 million painting, put it in the front vanity of your house and just have it there? It's impossible to get insurance anyway, but it has a good resting place if you go to the Newer Gallery in New York. Next. Alyssa. Okay. A little technical stumbling block. I can talk if you like. I don't want to have the people sit there. Okay, so the next slide and the next discussion that should be there we go. I presume that everyone sitting here has seen the movie Woman in Gold, or knows about it, or is about to watch it on Netflix or the like. Just briefly, because the facts are so well known that many people know them better than I. Klimt was a struggling painter just around the time of the turn of the 20th century, beginning of World War I. And Austria was a great cultural mecca, particularly for Jewish people. And there were many people there who were of Jewish ancestry who did well, including Mr. Bloch-Bauer. He had a younger wife. His wife became friendly with Klimt. We'll leave it on that. And his wife was actually the subject of two paintings, that the second one you'll see in a minute, by Klimt. And she's the only female. He loved to do females. She's the only one that was actually used as a subject on more than one painting. There's a rumor that she also was a subject of The Kiss and others, but we don't know that. So this was the painting. It's beautiful. Like I said, it's at the Newer Gallery. At the time it was sold, it was sold to Ron Lauder for $140+ million. At the time, it was the most expensive painting. Since then, it's gotten a little more expensive with regard to the art market, but that's not what either Maria or I or Randy really thought about or cared about or made us work. What made us work is that it brought tears to us and tears to Maria when she got recognition. And my clients, all of my clients over 25 years, there isn't one client in this area of looted art, about half my cases are looted art cases, that has come and says, Don, let's make some money. So people need to understand that really what we're talking about here is a recognition of some way that culture comes back to our people. The theft of art and artifacts, as Eli sort of touched upon, was massive. The greatest property crime in history, millions and millions of dollars. And they're still looking for thousands of paintings. They don't know where they are. They could have been destroyed by the Nazis. They could be in hiding somewhere. Steve Wynn in Las Vegas could have them. Who knows? But anyway, we're still looking for lost paintings. And that's because, you know, at the end of the war, obviously, the Nazis tried to secrete anything they had done. Okay, next slide. This is Adele Black-Bauer, a little more sort of Asian in terms of theme. As I said, she was the only subject, female subject that he painted. Okay, next. Klimt was also quite a good landscape painter. Now, if you want any real intelligent critique of these paintings, my wife's in the other room and she's an artist. I could bring her in later on, but I like them. You can show them all the landscapes, Alyssa. They're very good. They're, I guess, impressionistic in a way. These are all scenes from where he painted and spent time. And these are all, okay, stop at this one for a second. So these other paintings were paintings that were basically painted by Klimt for Mr. Black-Bauer. And Mr. Black-Bauer kept them on the hallway on the first floor and created a little alcove that he dedicated to his wife. When his wife passed away, of course, it became a shrine in many respects. And all the other paintings you saw so far were those paintings painted specifically for Mr. Black-Bauer. This one's a little more complicated. We sought this on behalf of our family. It was awarded to another Holocaust family by the courts. The evidence was a little sketchy in terms of what's going on. One of the key witnesses was someone who remembered very little about her life, but did remember that this painting belonged to her family. It was a little bit tainted in terms of how it came across, but that was the last Klimt that was in our possession at some point. Next one. Okay. The Klimt case, we know what happened, or I hope we know what happened. In a 6-3 vote, the US Supreme Court decided that Maria had the right to have the paintings back. Now, the agreement that was basically made between the parties was that they would then go to arbitration. We got criticized. Many of our contemporaries, not Stuart Eisenstein, who's a colleague in a way of Eli's, but many of the private colleagues said, what are you doing? You won at the Supreme Court, go back, win at all the federal court levels. Well, those of us who are in the audience now are about 90% lawyers, I believe. And even if you're not, you know that if you win a procedural case, which was the 6-3 case, giving us the right to go back into court and not be dismissed at that point, you still have to go back and have a trial. Maria being in her 90s, and the firm that they hired to represent the Austrian museum. Most of the museums in Europe are owned by the state or state institutions, and that was true here of Austria in the way. So they hired the Proskauer firm, which is ironic because Judge Proskauer started that firm way back when, so that Jewish lawyers in New York would have some relatively good jobs in terms of what happened. But they hired someone. It was kind of just a small aside. At the beginning, it was handled by Scott Cooper, very nice man, not technically of Jewish origin. As the papers began coming in the case, we noticed that Tova Feldstein, Jimmy Cohen, and Sammy Friedman were associates that were assigned to the case and those kinds of people. And so you can draw your own conclusions as far as that goes. One last little footnote, and I'm going to move on from the Altman case. It was a landmark case. It's still used now in some sort of continuum by plaintiffs' lawyers because it stands for the proposition that no matter when this property crime took place, and no matter where, Europe or here, you have a right, if you fulfill the requirements of sovereign immunity, to go after the country and to be able to harness the machinery of the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act, which is an American legislative act, and which in an exception, everywhere else it limits a lot of laws, I'm sorry, a lot of actions, but in this case, it opens up an action when you can establish that the action was taken by the defendant for commercial purposes and was wrongful. It makes the Nazi taking virtually void ab initio. Okay, so that was the Ortman story, except I forgot one thing. I'm sorry. I'll be quick here. So basically, the last story that you might be interested in, I was presenting a paper to the 11th Circuit Conference near Mobile, Alabama. Very nice, very hospitable people. I was invited by the chief judge in Pensacola, Florida. And in the audience was Justice Thomas. Justice Thomas was, you know, a little bit more than COVID distance away, but not much more than that. This is pre-COVID. And I noticed Justice Thomas, who's very recognizable, is laughing. So I figured that day maybe my jokes, which are all spontaneous and don't always work, that day they were working. And he was laughing, and all of a sudden he looked at his iPad for about a minute, then he looked down and he started laughing again. When I finished, there were a bunch of questions, and my wife and I were starting to walk out to the back room, and he stopped me. He had a few security people there, and he said, Don, I enjoyed your presentation. I'd like to have a few minutes with you if we can have a cup of tea together. I said, sure. And it was very interesting because I got some closure that I didn't seek. He said, you know, I wanted to tell you, I voted against you. And of course, I'm not going to say, I know, Judge, you were wrong. So I said, yeah, Your Honor, I'm aware of that. He said, but I want you to know that both Judge Rehnquist, Chief Justice Rehnquist, and I felt you had a very, very moral case, and you had a good plaintiff, and we wished we could have voted with you. So I called Randy and I said, guess what? It's really, in a way, 8-1 in terms of what goes on there. Anyway, that's the story. Now remember, Ortman was 2004, and we're now in 2022. And there hasn't been, I think Eli hinted at this, there hasn't been a strict continuum from Ortman to, for example, the 9/0 losses, and we'll see what happens with Kassira. Our hope is that the essence of Ortman, what we talked about before, the recognition of Ortman, the way it was decided, will be still really a superstructure for future cases. Femme in Blanc was a little different story, painted by a guy named Pablo Picasso. I assume you heard of him. This painting was supposed to be lost. And all of a sudden, you know, just after Ortman, all of a sudden the painting turns up in the art registry group's list of looted paintings. And they discovered that it had been held by a gallery in Paris for many, many years. Then it was sold to a couple in Chicago who were very famous in philanthropic and art areas, the Alsdorf family. And they had two of these friends who lived in a White House in Washington, D.C. Ronnie and Ronnie's wife, I think they ran the country for some years, and they were very close. They were very close to the Reagans, Nancy and Ronnie Reagan. So it was a little bit of a problem to start out with, but we discovered that when we tried, well, let me back up for a second. I should tell you what happens. The art registry group contacted our client, our future client, Mr. Benningson, who was a law student at the time. And they said, you know, your grandmother had this painting and it was basically stolen from her, and here's where it is, here's what it is now. We suggest you get a lawyer, and we've had some success with Burris and Schoenberg. So we weren't the only ones they recommend. That's not really fair, but he hired us and we went into this case. What we discovered was that the painting was sent to a gallery in Los Angeles, actually on the Beverly Hills side of Los Angeles, for sale at a very high level. You know, as a Picasso painting and the like. But it wasn't public. It wasn't as if you could go to the LA Times and see an ad on page 7, or even some of the formal art publications and go to those. So it was being held in private homes, being home in private circumstances, held in a gallery, we learned in Beverly Hills. And the only way to get into that gallery is one of these old-fashioned private places. You knock 3 times, you say, "Hi, this is Joe. Sam sent me," and they open the door. Well, we figured we couldn't do it frontally. So my advice to everyone out there, if you ever have the need to hire an investigator, is get an ex-Mossad person who's living in California. I have a very close friend. First time I met him, he pulled out of his ear a microphone and all kinds of things like that. And I sent Modi, my friend, we're very well dressed, to the gallery. He knocked 3 times and he established with photographs that he took that they had the painting. Fine. We contacted the lawyer who we found out was the lawyer for the gallery. And he was cooperative and he said, "We'll be studying it and the like." And he told me that, you know, Mrs. Alsdorf never told him anything about looted art, and he's sure she's not the kind of person. She's a lovely, philanthropic oriented person, and nobody's going to suggest that she did wrong. So we had to work on that for a while. And one day he calls up and he says, "Listen, we're sending the painting back to Chicago tomorrow. For procedural reasons, you know, which he admitted, the statutes were better for him in Chicago than they were in Los Angeles. And, you know, the courts were therefore, the federal courts were therefore in a position to do better as far as that goes." And so went back to Chicago. Before it left, we went and sought an ex parte TRO, temporary restraining order. And the judge said, "I can't give you this. I've never given it out. You must give notice to the other side and come back tomorrow." We said, "By tomorrow, the painting may be sent." Sure enough, the painting was sent. We came back the next day. The judge was very upset with the other lawyer for sending it, although it wasn't against any particular rule. And we made an agreement that the federal government would essentially watch over the painting while it was in Chicago awaiting determination by this, okay? That's only a small part of the picture, and it would take far more than the limited time that I have available to tell you what happened next. Suffice it to say that we journeyed through the state courts. We did not have complete diversity because the gallery was a California gallery. So we had to basically sue in state court. We got thrown out of state court. The state court appeals court, the Court of Appeal, those of you who are in California know what I'm talking about, affirmed the result in that regard. We basically went up to the Supreme Court in California, and they voted 8-0 to take the case. Before, however, there was any hearing or anything else like that, I got a call in the office from an unidentified, I can't identify him for several reasons, person who was an assistant US Attorney General, who said, "I'm filing a case under the federal statutes that Eli knows more about because we have the authority to seek the recovery of stolen paintings. We think this was stolen. We like your facts. We don't think you've been treated fairly by the courts. I can't tell you who I am or anything else like that, but I'll serve you with a copy of the complaint." He files in federal court. Almost immediately, Mrs. Aldorf's lawyer contacts us. They had California counsel as well as their local counsel. They had California counsel as well as their regular counsel in Chicago. And he says, "Let's do some form of mediation, get sent down to the magistrate." Give Mrs. Aldorf credit. Very elderly woman, came, spent the whole day in the mediation session. And we ended up settling the case. And the client received in excess of $6 million for the Picasso painting. Now, shockingly, because I know nobody in the audience would have done this, after he got his considerable share of that money, he dropped out of law school. Now, I can't imagine giving up law for $6 million, but this happened in this case, and he's very happy. We're in touch with him from time to time. And don't feel sorry for Mrs. Alsdorf, because the painting remained in Chicago. She sold it for a profit a few years later, a couple of $1 million. Next. Just quickly, small Klimt painting. Every once in a while, as lawyers, we have immediate success. This one, we contacted the relevant authorities. This painting was released essentially for $1 million. And the painting basically was staying in the hands of the people who had it. And the $1 million was sent to our clients list, whatever the attorney's fees were. So it can happen. Every once in a while, it can happen without too much animosity. I must say, in the private sector, that most of the American lawyers, men and women, on the other side, who represent the museums and the like, are friends of ours. We don't like their arguments. We think they're procedural nests, but they're friends of us. So we don't have a lot of infighting, although we have lots of arguments about the cases. Next one. This is a Canaletto painting. The interesting thing, I like it's like metal on the painting. The interesting thing about this painting is we found it in a museum in France. When I say we found it, in several instances, we found it with the help of an art register group like the one I described to you. And they told us it was a looted painting. We contacted the museum. Oh, not yet. We contacted the museum and were directed to their lawyer, a very nice lady. She said, look, she said, I agree with you. You're entitled to approximately $3 million. We don't have the money. So you have to wait until we raise the money from a benefactor. So I'm waiting a very long time to hear anything. We're almost at the point where we felt we better seek some redress in Europe on this one. We didn't have the kinds of facts that we had in Altman. And just as we were about to do that, fortunately, I got to work early. And in the morning, very early in the morning, I picked the phone up and the lawyer's on the phone and she says, could you please give me your trust account because we're wiring the $3 million that we raised from a benefactor. So this one, after some arduous work, worked out. Next one. Okay, this is the final one I'm going to show you. Now, when I'm before a live audience, and particularly a live audience of students, I often ask, I say, did anybody in the audience ever really watch Desperate Housewives? And very few people answer. And I keep prodding them and some more people answer. This was a show that was on, I'm sure this audience, 100% nobody's ever seen it. But just as a test, I watched once and they used this painting as a backdrop at the beginning with the fig leaves going up and down. And so it became famous along those lines. It's a very well-known painting in that regard. It was in and is in the Norton Simon Museum of Art. These cases, as described before, are often multi-layered by way of litigation. The federal courts spent a lot of time on this case, up and down in terms of various issues. In the end, sad to say, Judge Walter determined that the painting should remain in Norton Simon Museum, in part because there was a conflicting claim, although not, we believe, a legitimate claim, by a relative of the person who claimed the painting as opposed to us. And he was someone who lived in America and the like. So it took a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of legal working as far as that happens. It's part of the Guttsticker recovery, famous recovery. Jacob Guttsticker was one of the most well-known collectors and art dealers. He had moved into Holland thinking it was safe. When Holland was bombed, he left his gallery in the hands of a caretaker. He fled on a ship and he died, unfortunately. He fell to the ground on the ship and was killed by the fall. And his widow came across to Connecticut and his descendants ended up trying to seek back a lot of these paintings that were taken. It turned out many of them were in Goring's hands. Goring was he was unbelievable, Goring. The Germans are losing the war. They need railroad cars. And there he is. I see, Alyssa, that they put me back on. Now, is that because everybody's tired of paintings or we're at a time level? Okay, anyway, Goring was a person who somebody described him as going to Paris and thinking he was in a candy store when he went to the various museums and the pieces he took in the like. The one thing about the Nazis, they did understand value, the top Nazis. So they took the big ones and the more valuable ones were given to Adolf Hitler. So I thought the slides might give you a superstructure. I again apologize because There's so much law involved in this. It's somebody asked me once, you know, in a young person in the audience, they said, how do I become like you? They weren't talking about me in any sense other than a looted art attorney. So I said, well, you got to really emulate Eli Rosenbaum. And then beyond that, which was in a serious vein, you have to basically be involved in some way to help our people restore its culture. That's what I like to do. I've been practicing law for 50 years now, and I have one cardinal rule that I recommend to anyone that works in this area. I talk to anyone who's a survivor. They may not have a case. It may have to go to a charitable organization. There may be a statute of limitations that's over right now. There are people to call and to look into, but they deserve a few minutes of your time based on everything they've done. And I have to tell you, it's very important to me as a person who spent years in the trenches. Anyway, I thank you for honoring me by having me today and letting me sort of pontificate a little bit. Thank you. Thanks, Alyssa.
Thank you, Don. I was not trying to cut you off, but thank you so much for your presentation. And I will say, I do know that we have a couple of Holocaust survivors amongst our participants. I don't know because of the structure of the Zoom right now, but I had been emailed by them to make sure that they would attend. Their names, I hope it's okay to say their names are Miriam and Dan Sussman. They were survivors from Poland. And I hope, I'm glad that some survivors did hear about the program.
We're honored, Alyssa, we're honored to be in their presence. And we would take a moment to say thank you so much. And we hope in a way that we brought some substance to your suffering.
Seconded by me.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And before we move on to questions, I do have some questions of my own and then we'll open it up. But we do want, because there are so many lawyers in the AJLJ who have done some actually incredible work, do want to point a few more of them out who are amongst us. And I'm going to have Rhonda Lees, our one of our vice presidents, just recognize them for a moment. Rhonda.
So interestingly, the two people that I want to point out are not lawyers, but they have worked on this issue and they have also spoken to AHALJ. So I want to recognize them. Dina Gold, journalist, wrote a book called Stolen Legacy about her successful case to get her family's building back in Germany. And the other person I wanted to recognize is Bill Choike of the American Bar Association, who puts together a roving program called Lawyers Without Rights. And we have heard them speak. It is a book like this about the fate of Jewish lawyers in Berlin after 1933. I did want to say, if you want more information about AAJLJ, I'm putting it in the chat. That's it, Alyssa. Thank
Rhonda,
you.
just a very small footnote on the point you raised about what happened to German Jewish lawyers. The Museum of Tolerance out here had a terrific program chaired by Steve Rohde, a good friend of mine and a civil rights lawyer, on that subject. It would be great for you to contact him on behalf of the organization. I know he'd love to talk to you. And it was a heartwarming thing to be at this and to be able to see descendants of some of the lawyers who actually got out of Germany and what was happening, that at least they weren't killed in that regard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Rhonda. And
Can I add, as long as we're holding up books, I don't know if this is going to show, but I have Dina Gold's book here at home. So
I read it.
Fabulous.
I read it. It's
Book.
very good. Very good.
Bravo.
yes, as with I. Thank you. A lot of people here have written wonderful books, actually, and I hope that everyone will share that through the AJLJ. we welcome that. But another thing, so I do want to turn over some questions to Arthur, Don, and Eli. I hope that you guys will be willing to answer some of those. I'm going to start kind of from a legal substantive area. We didn't really discuss the Germany, the Philip cases, and the Simon v. Hungary cases much. And the AJLJ actually worked on a couple of amicus briefs. I was on the team, and Arthur was counsel of record. So a decision came down in, I believe it was February 2021. So maybe Arthur, if you could go into that a little bit. The decision that came down, it wasn't the best one, unfortunately. But also, of course, all of the cases focus around the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, which is something that Don had brought up. Maybe you could elaborate on the FSIA as well a bit, and just make sure that we all understand the legal concept.
Yeah, I think I'll be pretty general, and Don, if you want to add anything or correct anything I say, please do. Basically, the two companion cases that were at the Supreme Court being argued at the very end of 2020, one from Hungary, one from Germany, were both large-scale restitution cases. In Hungary, relating to a variety of types of property taken from a variety of plaintiffs, who were representing a class of Hungarian Jews who'd been subjected to this mass plunder as part of the Holocaust in Hungary. And in the other case, in Philip, the German case, an art theft, forced taking. So there was only an opinion in one case, Philip. And that opinion dealt with a question presented, but didn't really deal with how it applied to that case. And so what the Supreme Court held was that, by a 9-0 vote, that the specific legal principle there, what's called the expropriation exception to the rule of foreign sovereign immunity, that says a foreign sovereign is not immune from suit in American court if they are being sued for a taking in violation of international law, did not cover what would be considered strictly a domestic taking, a government taking property from its own national, for a variety of reasons related to the international law of property at the time of the passage of the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act. One of the things we emphasized in our briefs, and in particular, I think the Simon plaintiffs also emphasized in theirs, was that there were a variety of reasons not to consider either of these sets of plaintiffs to be nationals of the countries that had taken their property at the time of the takings themselves. In Germany, it was much of the way towards the passing of the Nuremberg laws at the time that the property was taken. In Hungary, there are a variety of nuances to the issue, including the fact the takings took place after Hungary seized some territory early in World War II, territory that had not previously been part of Hungary, that the United States never recognized as part of Hungary, and that raised really unique and really detailed factual issues. So all of that will be dealt with on remand, but that's the situation now, that it'll be dealt with on remand in both cases under that rule, that the plaintiffs will have to show that these weren't domestic takings in order to prevail.
Arthur, I just add one tiny footnote. As you suggest, it rotated around the fact they were their own citizens. Nick O'Donnell, who's the main lawyer in the case and is a very good friend of mine, was astounded that people could consider Jewish people at this time in Germany or Hungary to be 100% citizens when it was taken. And so there was some shock as far as that went.
Yes, and also,
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, it's okay, Eli.
If I may, this is a classic Eli, and I want to caveat that I am speaking in my personal capacity, but I wanted to pick up on something that Don said before, since we're talking about art, and that is Jewish associates at Proskauer working against the survivors, and brought to mind a question I was asked a long time ago, which is, could I represent a Nazi, defend him? And I thought about it, and my answer was, with one exception, the answer is no. And that exception would be if there was no other capable lawyer in the entire United States who would do it, and then I would feel duty-bound as a member of the bar, a member of the profession to do it. But that, of course, that would never, ever happen in a country with the number of lawyers that we have. But it has come to my attention over the years that there are many, many Jewish lawyers who represent German companies and museums and galleries in these kinds of cases. That is to say, they are on the opposite side of the battle from the survivors. And that is a line that I could never imagine crossing. I would never do battle with a Holocaust survivor. And I think one day somebody, talented law student or someone, might do a piece on this, do some research, see what happened here. And again, as proof that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, they might also look at how often the United States government has been on the other side. Don and Arthur will know better than I, but the impression I've had watching at some distance within the Justice Department, but keeping an eye on it generally, is that irrespective of what president and what party is in power, the Solicitor General is usually taking the other side, so to speak, including in cases where they were on the wrong side, according to the Supreme Court, when it subsequently decided the case. And as Alyssa knows, because we've discussed this at length, the case that continues to trouble me is the Holocaust insurance case, the Garamendi decision of the Supreme Court in 2003. Again, the Solicitor General was on, I believe, on the other side. I'm sure they were on the other side. I would like to associate myself with the vigorous dissent of Justice Ginsburg, and I would go further than she went. But a story for another day. Story for another day. Thanks.
Thank you, Eli. And it is of note, the Supreme Court just heard about a week ago, actually, the oral arguments in the Kasserer case.
Right.
And in that particular case, the Solicitor General, I believe, did write an amicus brief on the right side, we would say, for the heirs of the survivors.
Again, in my personal capacity, I say, will wonders never cease.
And we will see, hopefully, in 2 or 3 months, what happens, what they decide. We will definitely be following that. So we have so many questions for Eli, and I'll just try to keep it, relatively to a minimum. But I do know, even though Eli, a lot of your work has centered around the pursuit, investigation, and prosecution of Nazi war criminals, you have done some work involving Nazi-looted art. I know we had discussed that. So if you want to go into that a little bit, I'd love to hear it.
Sure, thanks, Alyssa. So or I should say our office's involvement in this is nothing compared to the extraordinary work that Don has done over so many years. I'm, of course, biased, because Don and I both went to William Trusper Clark High School in Westbury, and although I graduated, I guess, 11 years after he did, they were still talking about Don. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, youthful antics. But in the days of the latter part of the last century, when belatedly the public and the media began to pay attention to this enormous larceny that Nazi Germany and its allies had committed, and that Stuart Eisenstadt, who was first at State and then at Treasury in senior positions, undertook to, at the direction of President Clinton, to coordinate a federal response to what was being disclosed. I volunteered our small office to assist, and we did the major investigative work on the subject of looted gold. And actually, the historians in my office did an amazing job of proving what the Swiss government had denied for over half a century, namely that looted Nazi gold, gold looted from Jews, including gold taken from the mouths of Holocaust victims whom they murdered, had been traded during the war by the German Reichsbank to the Swiss National Bank in exchange for Swiss francs, which the Germans could use as a hard currency to buy things that, among other results, extended the war, so led to more deaths. And as this was going on, suddenly there were many stories appearing about looted artworks in galleries and museums, principally in Europe, but also here and there in the United States. And we were talking about that in my office, and I said, you know, we can play a role in this. No one has said anything about the principal federal collection of art, the National Gallery here in Washington. Maybe we can take a look and see if there are any issues in their collection. And what made that possible for us was we had just received from the National Archives, through the intercession of actually somebody who worked for Senator Glenn on the Hill, who thought we should see this, a document created by US military after the war, listing thousands and thousands of artworks that were missing and presumed stolen. So we compared the works on that list after we labored for quite some time to try to make sense of the list. There were lots of artist names misspelled. Many of the artworks had no significant or meaningful description. It would be, you know, still life without the precise dimensions of the canvas or anything that you could really use to identify the work. But there were quite a number of works that we could identify. And one of our great lawyers, Bill Kennedy, I assigned him to work on this, and he mobilized a team of people, and they did these comparisons. The National Gallery had, I believe, only recently launched an outstanding website that included provenance information. So we were comparing names and looking for gaps, especially around the Second World War in provenance. And we had questions about 4 artworks. Right around that time, I remember being in Stu Eisenstadt's conference room. I don't recall now whether it was State or Treasury, but we were in the conference room having one of our periodic interagency meetings. I represented the Justice Department in all of this. And I was sitting next to Rusty Powell, longtime director of the National Gallery. And the subject of looted art was raised by Stu, and there was some discussion. And Rusty said, well, I'm glad at least we don't have a problem at the National Gallery. And I said to myself, well, we're going to see about that. Eventually, not long thereafter, we did the good government thing, and we contacted the National Gallery, told them what we were doing. Don't think I ever told them that Bill Kennedy spent endless hours in their library, you know, and gave them the information that we had and asked them to please pursue it. Didn't hear anything back until about 2 years later, when I trudged down the driveway one morning to pick up the Washington Post, and I saw in there, maybe on the front page, a story about how the National Gallery on its own had investigated its holdings and had settled on a work of art, not coincidentally, one of the 4 that we told them about, Still Life with Fruit and Game, by the 17th century Flemish artist Frans Snijders. They had discovered this on their own and were going to return it, or had returned it, to the Stern family in France, from which it had been looted. I later heard, and I don't know if it's true, that actually what finally prompted that was that a representative of that family had noticed the artwork on their website and filed a claim. But it was very disconcerting. And to my surprise, my boss at the Justice Department said, you know, we ought to get the true story out. And so we were allowed to talk to the press. Reuters did a fine article on this, and then Paula Amen of the Washington Jewish Week did a more detailed look at it, for which she won a major investigative journalism award. So it was, in a way, good that the story finally came out. The other story I would quickly tell is in about 1998, there was a conference held at New York University Law School on the subject of looted art, Nazi looted art. I'm looking for the piece of paper where I had this, and it's not showing up. But oh, there it is. And Stu Eisenstadt was supposed to speak, and he had a conflict at the last moment and asked me to go up there instead. And I said, okay, my knowledge of this is a bit limited, but I'll go. And so I did. And it was a packed auditorium. Among the things I said, and it's reprinted in the New York University, whatever New York University Law Journal it was that reprinted the proceedings, I said the following: considering the fact that the resources available to individual families are limited, I mean, there's only one Don, right? It is an enormously welcome development that not-for-profit organizations like B'nai B'rith and the World Jewish Congress have launched their own efforts, thanks in part to the pioneering efforts of Hector Feliciano. I emphasize those efforts over those that have been belatedly commenced within the art world, such as that of the American Association of Museum Directors, because I would submit that the major players in the art world, including museums, galleries, and collectors, have very little credibility left with Holocaust survivors. Not only do they, these museums and galleries, collectors have a vested interest in retaining artworks, but they are precisely the entities and individuals that collectively averted their gaze from this terrible problem for over half a century. In a sense, hoping that the ugly legacy of Hitler's thefts would have the same quote unquote biological solution that the ugly legacy of Napoleon's thefts had had. But it has turned out, I said, that many of the survivors of the Holocaust have inconveniently decided to live into the next century. And now they have highly, I guess this has been early 2000 then, highly effective advocates such as the people that I already mentioned. And they also have highly effective advocates in government, both in this country and in some foreign governments. Anyway, I said that, and one young fellow way back in the auditorium interjected his objection that I wasn't being fair to museums and galleries. And the audience did not like what he was saying, and he was basically being shouted at. And a number of people, almost in unison, said, "Do you represent museums?" And he kind of ignored that, but they kept at it. And finally, he said, "Yes, I do represent museums." And the room erupted in laughter. He turned red and he sat down, was not heard from again. Those are my art stories. Thanks, Alyssa. I just want to add one more thing, which is I don't think, but I yield to Don's expertise in this, that the world has changed all that much in the ensuing 20 years.
Yeah, I like to think that a small part of that, may be erroneous, but I'm very concerned when I see people marching in Charlottesville with signs, "No Jew will take my job." I realize that we still have a lot of work to do and to go through and the like. So I do too, but I like to just leave our people with the thought that keep on fighting. I mean, Eli and I can't do it forever, and Arthur can't do it forever, but just keep on fighting. Give us help. I mean, whatever we can do, and talk to these people. And in government, it may be a little more difficult, Eli, in that regard, but in private practice, if you get a call from a person who's been in 5 concentration camps, she's entitled to a 15-minute talk explaining why legally there's not much we can do, but you can go to Bet Tzedek or you can go to another organization and try it. So I hope, with all due respect, because I love you dearly, that a little piece of what you just said will prove to be erroneous.
Hope so too. I'm waiting.
Yeah. I might say one other thing, Alyssa, if I'm not interrupting you. The classic question that maybe all three of us get asked, I know I get asked it all the time. What are you doing, going into the court with activities and wrongs that occurred 70, 80 years ago? It's past us. Who cares? And I think there's several answers to that, but one is, if it's wrong, it's eternally wrong. And then another one is that, as you suggested at the beginning, this principle must apply to Rwanda, Bosnia, and I know Eli's been active in those areas. I think Arthur has to some extent. We have. I was on an interesting panel. I thought it was interesting, not because of me. I was invited to speak in Canada to the chiefs of the First Nations. Canada does not use the term Indians. They use the term, much nicer term, First Nations. And the chiefs of First Nations were there. I was bombarded, Eli and Arthur, with questions. Well, what exactly happened in the Bennington case? It sounds like something that we were looking into with a graveyard case and the like. So I think the universality is so important, and I believe in humanity and the like. So that's my sort of added point. Sorry, Alyssa, I didn't mean to roll on.
No apologies. So I think what we should maybe end with is hope towards the future and some indication of where we might go next. I've had some discussions with Eli, and he somewhat cheekily mentions the biological solution, and that soon, if not, there was a case 2 years ago that Eli prosecuted where that may have been the last Nazi war criminal. And so most of them will be gone soon if they're not already. And so where do we go next? And I want to see what Arthur has to say about this, where he sees the future of genocide litigation, Holocaust litigation, restitution, and just something about what you're doing and what you think can be done.
Thanks. And I saw there was a similar question in the chat, and I was thinking about it for a bit. I think there are 4 parts to the answer. The first is there's still Holocaust litigation. There have been 3 cases argued at the Supreme Court in the last 14 months or something like that on Holocaust litigation, which is really an enormous number, given the limitations on the court's docket. There's an ongoing trial of a concentration camp commander in Germany, the guy who commanded allegedly Stutthof. And so, yes, there's a limited number of years that this will continue to happen, but there's still meaningful Holocaust litigation. The second is to say that there are a couple of different concepts from it that are transferable, and I'll go through those one at a time. The first, I think, is there's important anti-Semitism litigation being done currently in the United States. And we were reminded of the importance, I think, of contemporary work on anti-Semitism by the events in Colleyville, by the terrible hostage taking in the synagogue there. And I'd point to the work my colleagues at the Brandeis Center have done, for instance, on anti-Semitism in the United States. Wonderful. The second type of work, I think, that is transferable is work on other types of restitution for victims of mass atrocities. Don suggested a couple of places in the world that might be applicable. I'll just suggest a couple of others. One reason I think Germany was so committed in the Philipp case to the domestic takings rule is they were also defending in federal court suit by the Herero people of Namibia, who they subsequently admitted they had committed genocide against. And closer to home for many of us, or my colleagues who I'm honored to say is on this call, Alyssa Lewin, is one of the lawyers who's done the most litigation on behalf of Jewish victims of terrorist attacks, seeking compensation and damages for those. And then the last thing I'd say, and maybe hearkening back to the end of your introduction, Alyssa, is that we're not experiencing a shortage of atrocity crimes in the world. And the same legal principles, as I tried to underscore at the beginning of my opening, and at the end, I suppose, of my remarks now, an hour or a little bit more ago, the same legal principles that were set out at Nuremberg, the same legal rules that decide what is genocide, what is a crime against humanity when it's committed against a Jew in Poland in 1942, or a Jew in Lithuania in 1941, or Ukraine or Hungary in 1944, are the same rules, essentially, that decide whether something is a crime against humanity or an act of genocide if it's committed against a Rwandan in 1994, or against a Rohingya in 2017, or a Syrian anytime in the last decade, or a Yazidi. And so those rules and the skills that it took to do those cases well, which is a whole separate conversation, I think, given the complexity of those cases, the skills that it took Jackson and Ben Ferencz and lawyers like that to marshal the types of evidence that they had in front of them, the quantity and variety of that evidence, and build cases that proved what Jackson had asserted, this unique, comprehensive plan of annihilation, and that it went all the way up to the top level of the leadership. Aside from being an enormous historical fact, aside from being an awful truth that I think has changed a little bit how the world grapples with individual rights for the last 75 years, that is a massive investigative, analytical, legal challenge. And the skills that it took them to do that have helped determine how people will do cases like this going forward.
Thank you, Arthur.
Yeah, I can jump in on that as well. As far as the future is concerned, obviously the future will not feature many more prosecutions of Nazi perpetrators. The quest for other kinds of justice, including restitution of looted art, will continue. But there are people like Arthur who are on the front lines of preventing future crimes against Jews and others, and that, I think, has to be going forward the focus. We live, as I know we all see, in perilous times. The Attorney General has established a hate crimes enforcement and prevention initiative. The FBI Director, Chris Wray, has announced that the Bureau is ramping up its efforts, has already ramped up its efforts against white supremacists. And I think one can, in some sense, see a straight line from Nazi Germany to what people, including many who marched in Charlottesville, are espousing now. And I think what we have to do is use our imaginations and not be surprised. The Nazis told us exactly what they were going to do, and people assumed that they weren't serious. There is a 1936 New York Times story that I would commend to everybody's attention if they haven't seen it. The headline speaks of some talk that Julius Streicher gave, and he said that the Jews are going to be, quote unquote, exterminated. That's the word in the headline too. And no one believed it was possible. It had never been done in modern times. And in fact, it was possible and it happened. There was a lack of imagination before January 6th. No one envisioned it, it happened. So the unimaginable can happen, and we need to support the work that Arthur is doing, that Brandeis is doing, that ADL and others are doing, and the wonderful group that brought that successful case recently against the Charlottesville perpetrators, to use the law, the rule of law, as best we can to conquer hate and make this country safe again, including for us.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Eli. I think it's definitely important to end on a call to action to remind us all what we must continue to do.
We civil lawyers will follow Arthur and Eli in any way we can, because even as the victims themselves dry out, we have their descendants, we have certain actions that have been taken that should be righted. And I know as long as I can, you know, get up in the morning and read my law book, I will try to be helpful to people like Arthur and Eli.
Thank you so much to the three of you for joining us tonight. Thank you to everybody who has joined us tonight. I also want to say thank you to my colleagues at the Jewish Lawyers Guild. A number of you joined us. Thanks so much. Ron Catters, the president, and Judge Kapnick and Ira Pollack, and I believe there were more. But thank you. And I know that we're 2 days before the 77th year that marks the liberation of Auschwitz. And hopefully let's make sure we never see something like that again. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Alyssa.
Great job. Good night. Thank you, Eli, Don, Arthur, Alyssa.
Rhonda, our pleasure.
Thanks, Rhonda. Thanks, Alyssa.
Okay. Thanks, Arthur. Thanks, Eli.
Thank you, gentlemen. Honored to appear with you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Alyssa, for a wonderful, wonderful job.
Yep.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.